Hello and welcome to our third section, Managing Remote Systems with PowerShell. In this section, you can tell we're going to be getting away from doing that local administration that we've done in the previous sections, and now we're going to be doing a better pattern where we're going to be getting on a management computer and making connections to remote servers so that we don't have to go logging into each one through remote desktop, and we don't have to go accessing each server individually. We're going to talk and get started with an overview of PowerShell Remote. Then we're going to dig into endpoint configuration, where we're setting up the endpoints on the remote server, as well as enabling PowerShell remoting on our local management workstation. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper and show you some really cool techniques for passing variables to our remote sessions, getting and saving output from our remote sessions into variables, and working with some of the advanced techniques. Welcome to an overview of PowerShell remoting. In this video, we're going to see the concepts of PowerShell remoting, making sure that we understand what the WS-man and how the WinRM implements it. We're going to be taking advantage of some remote-enabled commandlets with ComputerName parameter, and we're going to show you which of those commandlets no longer operate in the PowerShell Core 6 version. And we're also going to talk about using WMI management remotely with the SimSession commandlet. And then the bread and butter of remote administration, we're going to be using the Invoke-Command to perform commands on remote machines. Now, in this video, we'll be talking mostly about the concepts here. So we'll be using these commands in later videos, but first I want to make sure that you understand exactly what we're doing. And then we'll talk about remoting and getting into a remote session interactively. Now, before we go diving too deep into PowerShell remoting with configuring the endpoints and performing actual remote administration, I want to make sure that you understand all of the concepts that you need to work and really flourish using PowerShell remoting. Let's understand first that PowerShell remoting is enabled through a protocol called WS-man. Windows RM, or WinRM, is a service that runs on the Windows operating system, and it implements that WS-man. Inside the WS-man, there's a full suite of kind of this framework there that's listeners and ports and making connections in. It really is like a small web server that's running and performing connections and allowing those connections to come in to manage different aspects of the operating system. Now, there's other commandlets that are leveraging WinRM. So we mentioned the sim commandlets in a previous video, and those commandlets have a lot of remote powers that are available to them. They can really take advantage of doing some broad administration through a lot of remote machines, and they all use that same WinRM and WS-man underlying technology. Remote administration can often be done by invoking the ComputerName parameter of a command. Now, we started with even very early versions of Windows PowerShell where commandlets like getProcess and getService would use a -ComputerName parameter, and you could get processes that are running on remote machines. This even was available to us without fully enabling PowerShell remoting. That's because those commandlets did not implement their remoting through WinRM and WS-man. However, now in PowerShell Core 6, all of our remoting is done through WinRM and WS-man. So what we have is the sim commandlets, and these are, as we discussed in the previous video, these are a way of interacting with the WMI. And sim commandlets can be used directly on remote machines by using the ComputerName commandlet parameter. The WS-man, of course, is this implementation of remoting, and there is a module that supports that. So there are a bunch of commandlets available to perform administrative tasks on all aspects of your WS-man implementation. Get Win event, we discussed that in system administration section, and the get win event commandlets can also be run against remote machines. Computer account commandlets, including rename computer, restart computer, and stop computer, are all able to be run against remote machines by using ComputerName. And PS session. We are about to dig deeper into PS sessions, but we can at least mention them here and say that the way we invoke these PS sessions, which is going to give us that ability to perform remote administration through one or more remote machines, is done through that ComputerName parameter. And finally, a send mail message is a command from previous versions of Windows, and I'm happy to see that we can still use the ComputerName parameter in PowerShell Core 6 to send mail messages from remote machines. Now, there are a couple of omissions in PowerShell Core 6 that especially were noticeable because they've been there for so long in previous versions of Windows PowerShell. And getProcess and getService, both of those used to have a ComputerName parameter, and they no longer have that ComputerName parameter. So if you are still in Windows PowerShell, you can still use getProcess-ComputerName and processes from a remote computer. In PowerShell Core 6, those are now accessed through the more standard PowerShell remoting, and we are going to get into that right now. So in cmdlets, we can use a sim session or ComputerName to access the sim classes and the sim instances from remote systems. You'll remember back to our video on cmdlets. They were very powerful. You were able to invoke WMI methods. You're able to invoke both static class-based methods as well as instance-level methods to, say, start a process against the Win32 process class or stop a process from a Win32 process instance of Notepad. Now, getSim class is able to retrieve the sim classes from remote computers. getSim instance is also able to do the same thing, and we also add in new sim session when we're talking about remoting. Sim session is a way of providing a different name. For instance, a group of servers that are all your domain controllers, you could name that session domain controllers. You could provide alternate credentials for working with different domains, different ports if you needed to configure different ports for accessing those, and many more session configurations. Once you have created a sim session, that is typically stored into a variable, and then that variable can be passed in to the sim class or sim instance or invoke parameters, the invoke sim method as a parameter. Instead of -ComputerName, you would use -session. Invoking commands on remote machines. These are even for commandlets that don't have that remoting built in. If there's no ComputerName parameter on it, you are not limited. You can still use everything that you need to use on a remote machine by using Invoke-Command. Invoke-Command can pass in either single commands or files, and it can go against one or more remote computers. And it's very robust how much you can do. In fact, of course, you wouldn't want to be typing hundreds of computer names, but more than likely you can get that computer list out of an Active Directory or some sort of a server list that's already there, whether that's in Azure or Active Directory, and then you can process that command running against hundreds of computers in one line of code. And notice that you can also process either single commands or pass entire script files into Invoke-Command. So very powerful stuff. And similar to having sim session, where we could name a session and then access it over and over again, or set alternate credentials and ports and session configurations, we can do the same thing with Invoke-Command, where we can use new PS session to create a session, one or more computers using special credentials or accessing session configurations or alternate ports, and then that variable can be passed in to our Invoke-Command using the session parameter. Finally, I wanted to mention entering a session on remote machine. So let's say we've got that session and we've created a session for a remote machine. We can then enter that session. Now, we could do it just like this, which is enter PS session, ComputerName, and that will give you an interactive session on the remote computer using your current username and password, or you could specify alternate credentials using the -credential parameter. In this instance, where you're just entering a PS session and by ComputerName, that session is temporary to the remote machine and to this session. When you exit the PS session, the PowerShell session that you had is gone, along with any variables or any persistent data. Now, in that interactive session, anything that you run is run against the remote machine, all of your environment variables on the remote machine. And there are some technical differences between this and Telnet, but if you're familiar with Telnet, this is going to look very similar to it's going to seem like you're just telnetting into the machine, and the enter PS session is the way for PowerShell to make that remote session interactively work with that remote machine. Similar to Invoke-Command, you can use ComputerName or session. And the great thing about using a session, even if you're just using for one computer, well, enter PS session, you're only going to be entering one computer. But if you wanted to have a session instead of a computer name, well, then your session is going to be persistent. You can enter and exit that PS session repeatedly and not drop any variables or any persistent data that's there.